putting a value on something when people expect you to be there because of love. And for me, this also, dancers came out. I was part of the Dancers Forum for a while. And I think the compact is something everyone should look at because, we don't have standard operating procedures in this field. We don't even discuss it. And one of the things that I'm trying to push is for colleges to actually institute programs that teach you about the business of dance. To me, it seems insane that people spend thousands of dollars and leave without, leave in debt, and they have no idea about how the field works, no idea about what they should ask for. You know more what to ask for when you go to an interview at McDonald's than if you were somebody asked you to dance for them. And so to me, that's sort of the basis of why we're already in sort of a weakened situation, because we leave school, if you go to school, if you take that route, you have no skills other than what your body is offering you. So that whole progress can also get a bit distorted as you sort of learn the ropes. And for one example is that when I was in Trisha Brown's company from 87 to 93, and when I first joined the company, we had no contract. And because somebody left and they decided to leave in their own time period, they instituted a contract. And the first contract was 1 page. And it basically said that you have to give us a year's notice, and we have to give you 6 weeks' notice. So there you have it. So and over the years, it grew, and I became one of the negotiators of the contract. And by the time I left, it was a 32-page document. And the reason for that being is that there are all of these little things of, how much you're going to get paid for class, and when does that rate increase, and how does your, and all of these things that, it's a business. It's really a business. And I think there's this idea of love and desire that changes the way we think about ourselves and how we negotiate what our fears are. Just to go on a little bit more, so I think there's this idea of education, but more importantly, dialogue. And the other thing that I wanted to touch on a little later is how we think of this as an ecosystem. How do you realize that there are all these things? You're not just an artist. So sometimes you're an artist and an arts administrator. Do you know what a curator does? Do you know how granting organizations actually work? And so it's not about a personal thing, but what are all of these things that lead up to that? What are their politics? And also, for example, we are kind of in a situation where things are changing, but the dance performance field is primarily supported by 2 foundations, Mellon and Duke. Either one of them goes away and the world drastically changes. And so I'm asking, how we as artists can become more of a collective. How can we consider other roles of developing sustainable models or developing dialogues with those people in power, whether they're foundations or governments or whatever, to create systems that actually serve us? Or maybe I'll turn that around and say, how do we describe our value, our economic value in the larger ecosystem? For me, there's one example that's looming of housing. I don't know, I moved back to New York in the early 80s. I don't know how people support themselves now. I don't know how much time they put into working to pay for their rent, and which is only going to get harder and harder. So eventually people are moving further and further out to the peripheries of the city, and eventually they move out of the city. What does that say about the field? And then, are we going to wait till that happens before we actually say something? So as a collective, where is our voice heard? Who is our voice? And how do we really make it, people are protesting a few blocks away for something that means something to them. They're taking the time to do this. And I'm not saying this has to be a protest, but I think we have to start considering as a collective what our power is, whether it's economically, and also be able to speak about it. I remember running into, there was a donor, I was on the board of this organization, and there was a donor who I met, and she said, well, I don't believe the government should give money to artists. I was like, why? She's like, well, you know, she gave some various reasons, and I basically translated it into, well, artists make a certain amount of economic change within, you can call it gentrification, but they make economic change within various neighborhoods, and that's been recognized nationally. And there are different places like Art Places and different other organizations that are trying to, across, in different cities, develop sort of pockets of artist housing or, you know, art organizations that will help or revitalize or, you know, other neighborhoods. So there are, I think, different economic models and paradigms that could be used, but part of that, I think part of the problem for me is we spend so much time, you know, working to get that next dollar that we don't see that the world is sort of shifting and moving behind us. And I'm afraid that we won't realize that until we've lost that last dollar. And so that's part of what I'm interested in initiating on dialogue at various levels with different organizations.
Simple as well.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So I just, as these conversations have happened, it feels a little bit like we have two branches and we're sort of heading towards one. To kind of name the other, for me, very significant has been the question of language and this word labor. So I wrote down labor, work, task, effort, exhaustion. Each of those has different resonance historically, specifically in dance, and I feel like we use these words. I certainly think of them practically in how I conduct my life and my working life and also within my work, but just to sort of name that these all have different political resonance, different resonance in our field, and that I'm interested in keeping active sort of an awareness of that. But I think this conversation is heading and needs to head towards more of the agreed upon sense of labor as work, paid work or not, some sort of exchange in that way. This, in thinking about this in relation to dance, I feel like I have much more clarity as a performer at this point than as a choreographer. I do both. If I could ask these four over here to stand up for just a moment. Okay, you want to do what you've done? Okay, so please stand here. You here. You can stand about yeah, or you take one step out. Yeah, you would over here, right? You know, so you can see that. Right. And maybe you two on the outside, if you wanted, you're able to shift your feet a little bit. You two in the center, keep your arms by your side. So this is the setup for Marina Abramovich's Imponderabilia at the MoMA, and these two are the unclothed performers, and these two are the security guards. And so I was one of these guys for a number of months, and I noticed as the hours would pass that our physical postures were uncannily similar. And the value of our labor and the understanding of our labor was so divergent, even though what we were doing in some ways was very similar. And these guys were as responsible for the experience of the audience member passing through that opportunity there as these ones were. And so it sort of pointed out a lot of the questions of what are the particulars of this kind of labor versus this kind of labor, how it's understood, and also these guys and us had a successful contract negotiation after our initial contract, which was aided greatly by some fainting that happened in the first days of the performance, which upped our pay. So just so you know, you don't need a tactic. We did not know these people when we were having our first round of negotiations, but we never saw us as an alliance, as different class of labor. I heard security guards, there's incredibly high turnover. In theory, they had stable employment, but many of them said that they were not at all. We were on a short-term contract and had to fight to go from being contracted labor to temporary employees. So all of this, I don't have the answers, but I noticed a lot of things going on there. And so that led to a lot of thinking, more abstract and more concrete. And then a few years later, I went into another negotiation to be not a re-performer, but a performance facilitator for another exhibit at the MoMA. And again, we went into a negotiation and it was successful, though it didn't work out so well for me. And that led to me contacting Wage, whose lead organizer, Lisa Sosconi, is here. And they were putting together, and maybe at least we'll have an opportunity to introduce this in more precisely, setting up a calculator, a rubric for institutions about pay for visual artists for various roles that they play. And I came in to help figure out a way that performers within a visual arts context could fit into this calculator so that institutions would have a baseline, and if they got approved by Wage, would have a minimum in terms of what they paid performers. And the goal was that it should be a day of work at a larger institution. If you go in there for a few hours and you travel an hour each way and you prep, and maybe you're, in danger physically and emotionally, that this is your day's work. And so then that's where we hit at the top end. And then as we went down, for instance, thinking about the kitchen, we met with their curators and thinking about the fees they paid. We realized that in order to mount some of the exhibitions that artists and they wanted to mount there, that we would have to give in terms of the baseline for performers. So we couldn't say a performer needs $100 for a half day's work or $200 for a full day's work, if we didn't want to say effectively it's not possible for these institutions. So that then, and then of course there's the point we know where there's no money and everyone's working for free. And so one of the questions it really raises for me, the MoMA is a no-brainer. Twice in the last few years, $35 an hour has been set as precedent, modest, but something. You go perform at the MoMA, you should get paid a living wage. Where does it tip over to the point where the performer is no longer hired work in that traditional sense where it's their work and they can subsist on it, and they start becoming a contributor to the possibility of an artistic work coming into existence, and so essentially taking an economic hit. So that's where that gray area happens and what comes in, and I think the Dancers Forum Compact is a great resource on this in terms of having a sense of ethics guided, and hopefully a sense of respect and a sense of love. But that trajectory is an interesting one with that spectrum.
I'm Luciana achugar. I'm a choreographer, dancer, but I haven't. Now I'm just a choreographer. So let's see.
Is there a real separation between that for you?
No.
Okay.
That's why but I don't know, we're talking about work, roles, labor is, so I'm actually been trying to not have that separation. I've been making work that is, let's see, we're like what has been talked about, I feel like I'm not necessarily, I guess my entering into this conversation is maybe from like how I've been approaching these issues inside the creative process. So when I started making work well, I started making work actually as a collaborative team with Levine and partially when we both started making work was after because we were dancing for other people and it felt like the only, I mean, this is part of my perception of it, is that partly that the only way possible to make work was as a collaboration, so as to not have this kind of hierarchy of choreographer top-down thing. So after working in collaboration with Levine, when I started actually working as this director role with dancers, I was continually kind of disturbed by the fact that there was that employer-employee relationship, or my relation in this relationship that feels like a collaboration, and that has to do a lot with what you were talking about. That is this agreement of this love that we have, that we agree working with people. I mean, I particularly like to work with people that I love, that I feel like we love together, this field, this form, that we have a kind of common mission that to me feels political, feels like a lifestyle. There's many things, so we share all that. But there is this this relationship. So what happened to me is that the work became about the role, the fact that the dancer to me is in that role of the working class. The dancer is in the field this working class laborer, because it's no coincidence. It seemed to me like, oh, dance, being around New York art scene, around other forms, it seemed that dance seemed like the poor art form, and to me it seemed like no coincidence, because the ones that are making the work are thought of as less valued, because their work is their body, their labor is their body. So I started making these kind of seeing these parallels between like a construction worker, like what are the lower end, lower paid things, like dishwashers, like construction work, like cleaning people, all the people that don't have this this intellectual knowledge supposedly, or like the ones that their work, the value of their work is their effort of their body, are in this, and that. So I started making work a lot, like literally a lot, showing that fact that to me the dancer is the working class aspect of the field, and at the same time to try to me to undo this problem of the lack of value of the putting that in the lower end in terms of value, like the creative, the ideas are up here, the intellectual, and then the body, the one that is just the doer of the thing, is the lesser valued. Seemed to me that also to go hand in hand with a kind of model of value that also has to do with a kind of Western Cartesian, like it's like I think therefore I am, and like the experience is less valued than thinking. A hierarchical model where like a more elevated spiritual things up here, intellectual, rational, and then again experience the body, shitting, fucking, feeling, sensing. So I feel, I don't know, I mean my little way that I feel like the only way I feel like when I try to deal with this problem, and I know it's not addressing actual money value, but I'm still working on getting there somehow, is from the actual how to work with dancers so that you're not treating them like the labor. But to me, what I started to realize, first I was just making work, there was a representation of that, like a kind of showing of this, and how the work, the exhaustion, the effort of the body is the labor, and dance is that to me. And then there's love, there's also the labor of love. But then now I've gotten to a place where it feels like that it feels like it has to be less a representation and more in the actual fabric of the work. It has to be subverted. So one way I'm trying at least to subvert that is by not using the bodies of the dancers as tools to create a product, because I feel like that's still, I still can't figure out how to undo this money exchange so that I actually want to pay the dancers more, because they need to be paid more so that they can survive and make a living from this, as I do. But at the same time, it feels that part of the problem is that we're still stuck on this capitalist model of production, that even though we're making dance, which the love of it is partly the fact that it isn't a product creating, it isn't a marketing thing, it isn't a creation of an object to be sold, but it is a production of experience, of love, of community, of all these things. How, to me, it seems like, if I, instead of working with the dancers to make this product and asking of them to serve this thing to then present, instead of asking them to be the servers of this product and then figuring out how to pay them, that's still within the product of like a factory worker in a way. And that's what's been disturbing to me all along. So I'm considering, can we make work that is serving us? So like, can we make the work that heals us, that supports us, that does what we need? That actually is like we're creating ourselves, the body we want to create, we're creating ourselves, the culture, the community we want to create within this, at least within this mini community that is being created by making the work that I'm proposing, rather than focused in the product. That is, yes, it's complicated because can I still get the money from the funders, from Doris Duke, and I mean, I've gotten more and more honest in the brand proposals. I just got a rejection from one of them. I mean, I did get them out too, but I also got some rejection. In a way, I wonder if it's because of being more honest about it, because what I'm saying is like, can I get some money, not for this production that you want me to prove it, but we really need to pay the practice that this work, the practice of these bodies, that these bodies becoming who they're becoming and doing the thing that we're doing. This is what needs to be paid. Because the problem is a lot of these funders, we're asking for money for this piece. We're not asking for money for that. So I feel like, as you're saying, we need to collectively, I was thinking now like, what happens when you're actually, I finally, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, okay, this is the last thing. I'm considering now, like, for the first time in my life, I finally am like a full-time artist, depending on what I make. I'm not depending on my Pilates teacher or waiting tables anymore. So now I'm in a very fragile financial situation. And I'm, of course, it's taken to this point for me to actually trying to figure out other models, but I'm thinking maybe we need to create like some kind of, I was thinking the other day, what if like collectively we make like some kind of, collectives where we apply for different projects and like I don't know, maybe it's too utopian, but whoever gets the grants, they put it into the pool. I mean, it has to be a small pool of people or something like that, where, and the funders, when you have to prove, you're like, well, yeah, some of that went to such and such project, but that was for you. Yeah, but we're like, like some kind of resistance. Because otherwise we're always competing against each other. Like, that's not what
great, Luciana.
I don't know, it's just an idea, I don't know.
Yeah. My name is Laris Cohen, and I make dance, and I used to perform for other people. And just a quick note about MoMA, because I was a performance facilitator there in 2011 to 2012. I learned something about the guards. So about 40% of them have that high turnover because they're subcontracted through a private security company named Clark. And so those guards are in the black suits without the MoMA embroidered there and without the union pin, and they're paid anywhere from $9 to $11 an hour, and they're used to sitting down at desks and being a security guard who sits most of the time, and so they're the ones who are fine shifting more because they're not used to standing for 8 to 10 hours on concrete. And then the other 60% of the guards have the embroidered MoMA, and they're a member of 32 BJ, which is a union of more people and other security guards, and they are paid $17 an hour when they're first hired, and that goes up, and folks stay for 15, 20 years. But anyway, MoMA saves money by sprinkling their MoMA guards around in key locations because they know the museum, they know the architecture, and then someone from Clark comes in and maybe only works one day or a week or something. Anyway, that's a standard museum practice in other institutions too. But so I think, so Kathy told me that she asked me on this panel because of a question or comment that I made, and question during the movement research town hall in, what was it, 5 years?
I think it's 2. Really? Maybe, okay.
Well, okay, I don't know. I'll be embarrassed if it wasn't that long ago because I didn't know about the compact yet. And I had been organizing with Jews for Racial Economic Justice, JFRIJ, on this campaign that go Power for Domestic Workers. It's called Shalom Bayit. It's a Justice for Domestic Worker campaign. So JFRIJ is an organization that does solidarity organizing. So we are an organization of Jews, primarily white, but not exclusively, who then leverage our privilege to work with people of color organizations on projects and campaigns that they've initiated, and then we lend our support, and it becomes our campaign as well. So this campaign was, we were partnered with Domestic Workers United, which whose members and constituents are Caribbean, Latina, and African nannies, housekeepers, and other caregivers. And so our JFRIJ's role was in organizing, and Abby knows about this too, another JFRIJ person, was to organize employers of domestic workers to join the campaign, and so what we had them do was first take steps toward improving their own employment practices. So that included, wage increases, giving paid days off, paid sick days, paid vacation, and then providing healthcare. This was before Obamacare, so it's a little bit different then. I'm not sure how the campaign has changed. I've left that now. That's why I think it was a little earlier. But anyway, and often the first step, and when we were working with employers, is to get the person to identify as an employer, because usually these would be parents who didn't see themselves as bosses. They'd be like, why is my nanny's calling me her boss, but I'm just a mom, And so some of our first conversations would be like, actually, this is an employment arrangement. You're paying someone to do labor, and this labor needs to be valued as real work. And there are reasons why domestic labor isn't valued as real work. It's because until recently, until JFRIJ and DW helped pass the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in New York State, on a national level, there are no basic labor protections for domestic labor, for domestic workers. And that has to do with a specific exclusion in the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, specific exclusion for agricultural workers and domestic workers, and that has to do with the legacy of slavery and making sure that Black workers weren't granted those protections. So those were the two fields that had historically been done by the work had been done by Black Americans, and so the U.S. racism carries through to this project, or to this campaign very directly through that legal path. So anyhow, I was wondering if we could export this model of organizing employers or transpose it rather to the dance community, because there's on one hand the institutional route, which Wage has done with some success in visual art institutions, although the model is different. The presenting model and commissioning model for dance organizations is quite different. I'm curious to talk with you about that if Wage can be involved in that. But I was just wondering, how can I personally be a better employer, and can I learn from the lessons that I learned as a JFridge organizer, and how to step up my own employment practices? What does it mean to be someone who makes poverty wages myself, and then also be an employer of other people? So that was the question I had asked, not even knowing about the compact. And it's still an open question, although, I wonder, does that say anything specifically about wages, like
No,
dollar amount?
we had discussed that, and also, what might it take to unionize dance field, particularly like the experimental or downtown dance field. And it really, quite frankly, it was something that a lot of people didn't want to do, and a lot of people didn't know how to do, but they felt that they could sort of address on a really more fundamental and interpersonal level, in a concerted and thorough way, the conditions of working that might encompass pay, but not sort of maybe any type of scale or prescriptive recommendations.
Because that
it was always seen as something that might happen, but that this was sort of more of an initial step.
Right. Because when I was leafing through that, and when I looked at it a few years ago, it didn't feel relevant to my practice, because I don't often use professional dancers, and so they don't know, like, warm up and cool down isn't necessarily part of the equation, and like often the performance is the rehearsal. And so while that's like a really important framework, I wonder about other models now, and also naming a specific wage that we agree upon is like, a living wage now in 2015 for performers. And anyhow, but so that was just one point. Am I out of time? Just one other thing is that I've been thinking through how labor works in my own practice, and I'm working on a project now that looks at OSHA regulations, so Occupational Safety and Health Administration regulations, which are there to protect workers supposedly, although they paradoxically often protect employers. When workers come with a grievance or an injury, employers can say, actually, you had a sticker on your construction hat, so workers' comp doesn't cover your head injury, because the adhesive on the sticker will wear away the hard hat's strength, even though having stickers all over your hard hat is part of like the construction worker culture, and everyone does it and violates the OSHA rules. So there are weird rules in there that actually protect employers weirdly. But I've been looking at how the rules for theaters specifically differ from construction sites, and what does that mean for the ontology of the theatrical space, and also dance as a field, and worker regulations within dance. And often it has no bearing whatsoever, because we have to sign contracts that say we are independent contractors. So we as artists presenting in a theater are not employees. It's only their in-house crew, or not even their crew. Oftentimes their crew are hired for the day, but their in-house technical director, all their folks, but they don't have in-house artists. At least a lot of institutions do. So that's one thing I'm thinking about. And then one last point is just that, we were talking about where's my note? What was your opening question? What's the value of dance labor?
Yes, or how is dance labor valued?
Oh, right,
how might it be? How can it affect them?
Right. How is dance labor? So in my practice, the question of what constitutes dance labor in the first place is often at play, because what a lot of my performing doesn't look like dance proper. It will look like I'm doing the work of a preparator or an installer or an art handler or a stage hand or a stage manager or something. And that strangely, it either makes my my labor, my performance labor, valued higher or lower than the dancer's labor, depending on the institution and the context and the project. And if you're curious about specifics, I can talk about that, but I'm learning a lot, and it's depressing.
I just want to say a few more things, and then maybe we should open it up. Just because I felt like I wanted to start in a very sort of specific or concrete place, which, you know, let's say for that purpose, for this purpose, that the compact is that. And then I kind of wanted to just revisit before I finish speaking tonight, or at least sort of sharing with you some things that I've been thinking about for a while. Wanted to sort of go to what I think of as being a little bit more of a broader context for these questions. And maybe I'll just throw some, I think there's a sort of through line here, but some of them might be jumping around. But I'm really concerned about how aware we are of, and I don't mean this in a condescending way, but like how aware are we in fact of what our condition is? Like, what do we how do we measure that? For example, what do we have at our disposal to be able to measure that? Whether it's a conversation with someone who's, you know, has a labor organizing perspective or role, or is it based on maybe an experience that we've had in one context and then we've had a different experience in another? Like, at what point and how do we arrive at an awareness about what our actual condition is? How do we measure that? Like, I think economists, you know, they do that by, you know, things like, well, how much were you paid yesterday versus how much are you paid today? How much were people paid, you know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago for the same thing? You know, I just kind of want to throw that out there. I think it's a tool, it's a device. I also think that there are certain standards that exist more broadly in our society and in our country, like minimum wage laws, which I think, like, why wouldn't we consider them as being relevant in, you know, in these contexts that we're in? Legally they are, and they're, you know, I've never really been in a context where I was working for someone else as a performer where somebody said, well, I'm gonna pay you minimum wage or I'm not gonna pay you minimum wages. But you know, they could, you know, and actually I've recently begun doing that. Like, I have made a commitment recently to paying at least minimum wage, and I actually made a commitment to paying more than that, to make paying a living wage over a succession of years. And I, you know, I'm not necessarily saying that everyone should do that. I think it's, you know, it's about where we are, you know, in our practice. How are we choosing to value our own labor or what we're doing, and others who we're working with. We use this term work, just by the way, you know, we use it like to describe what we do. I don't think it's a coincidence, you know, I'm making a work. It's a very peculiar use of the word, actually. You know, a lot of people who are not in the artistic field, when I've heard them comment about that convention that we have, and I think it's sort of an interesting work that might warrant consideration. I mean, certainly artists are talking about that, so they are thinking about it. I also want to just briefly say there are precedents in our field that sometimes I am concerned about whether or not people we are collectively aware of. You know, the question about who knows about the compact is one. Another is, like, do people know, particularly people who are younger than I am, do you know that there were individual artist grants at one time that were awarded by the NEA, by NISCA. Your relationship to funders was not mediated, to state government funders was not mediated by other parties in the field. That was a very important development in our field, and it you know, it was long fought, you know, to arrive at, and it really empowered artists deeply, and that was lost. as a result of, you know, the NEA4 and the culture wars in the 90s. You know, we can look even further back to like the New Deal, the 1930s and 40s, the efforts to pay artists, to have the federal government support the paying of artists, and that was a social good that could was collectively recognized, and that you know, that's been whittled away through the years, and the lack of federal support for our field, I think, creates the endemic conditions of undervaluing that we all experience, whether we're, you know, artists or presenters or other people in the field. And then just to finish up, you know, there is a modern dance, perhaps you already know this, has from its beginnings, from its origins in the 30s, it was very closely aligned with progressive politics and with socialism and communism and labor organizing. There's a very, very deep connection that was lost with primarily around the era of McCarthyism. Lastly, I think that you know, it took a lot of creativity to make those initial inroads, you know, whether it's the WPA or the NEA or creating NISPA, like it was created, you know, somebody thought of that, they imagined it before they did the political work of it becoming manifest. And I do think that we can imagine something other than what exists and that it can come about. And I think that we have these precedents. The 70s was considered the golden era of dance funding in this country. I'm sure it's all, you know, depends on, you know, your position. Well, they used to, yeah. Yeah. But, you know, I think that those times were based on they were based in a political will for them to be what they are, and I think that that's something that is possible still.
Can I just tag on to that one more thing? In reference to what she's saying, I think history and context is really important, and that's really part of the education that we're also talking about. We can't sort of pull a number out of the air. I think it's really important to also have a context. One of the resource guides I would also point you to is created by Brooklyn Commune. It's an amazing advocacy organization. It's also available online, brooklyncommune.org. And they generated this report, A View from Here. And it was created by a number of artists, administrators, and people in the ecosystem, pulling out historical perspectives as well as offering somewhat solutions, partial solutions for different players in the field. And I'll just leave it at that. But I think it's a really important guide to just sort of flip through, look through, just to give you a perspective on the field. So do we want to open this up?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. I mean, I know there's so much to potentially talk about, but I think if we just kind of, anyone has a thought or a question or comment, we can sort of.
I mean, I'm definitely curious what drew various people here, you know, and sitting here, this kind of like, there's just this question of sort of sharing of knowledge and how, what's important to share and how we do it. So, you know, it's
Well, maybe just as coming from Finland, maybe just as a comparison, where I think that in Finland dancers are more valued. There's a better grants system, and so they have, for instance, they have classes, very inexpensive classes. There's a group that applies for grants so that dancers can, professional dancers can
go take classes, which is also enhances your value that you can work with your body in an inexpensive way that you don't have to pay $20 expensive class in a subway. And then also they have the dance union. They have a very clear list about how much you should statistically pay, how much should be paid for work A, B, or C. And and I think that also like having some sort of guidelines, it does create understanding between organizations and like dancers and choreographers and organizations, like what should be accepted for someone to survive as a dancer, manage, that it's the work is valued. So,
I mean, Luciana, as we walk, I feel like it's a privilege even to be having this conversation. And some of that, I sometimes wonder if our lack of clarity and our lack of rubrics about how much one gets paid and all that implies a certain privilege, that we can do work and use our time without knowing these things. And what does that mean the shape of our community looks like? How does that affect us?
I feel sometimes like that's a privilege that I've claimed that's taking me towards the poorhouse. My name is Melinda Ring. I'm a choreographer, and I'm here. I'll speak to your question why I'm here.
Could you just speak up a little bit more? Sorry.
For the ambulance?
Yeah.
My name is Melinda Ring. I'm a choreographer. So, as a question, I often look at it as in this very practical way as my, like the lens of the budget that I'm posing. When I'm looking for funding or when I'm thinking about my project, I really value the people who are in the studio with me. It's at this point, the way I'm making work, the work wouldn't be made without those people in the studio. My process is so collaborative. And I was interested to hear what you were saying, the look towards collaboration and sharing, but I still feel that I'm somehow at the top and I'm responsible for these people, and I do see them, even though I'm trying to create a situation in which they have some ownership in the work itself. I feel responsible to help them exist, and I'm very concerned about it.
This isn't interminable. Really?
It's a big deal. It's what politicians do. There's a lot of police down there. So I came because it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. So I really do use that word labor. I really do think of the people who are working for me as somewhat employees if they're
We have a right.
But one of the things that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I think that this really, there's several ways that these questions impact my work. It's impacting how much work I can actually make, like how much time can I actually spend in the studio with people if I want to pay people. Something that seems legitimate. I do think about the minimum wage as a kind of rubric for that, but I also look at what else is in my budget, and I'm trying to find some balance to that because I'm very aware. I was interested in your situation here with the arts and these other relationships with other people who are involved in a situation. I'm very aware of these other line items in my budget and all the other people who are being paid around the work, like not only just within the budget that I'm that I'm creating. So lighting designer, my last piece didn't have costumes, so didn't pay for that. Didn't have sound, didn't pay for that. I mean, there's some aesthetic choices I'm making, but I'm also thinking about these ideas. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a long time when I was dancing in other people's work, and I became aware that the composer was being paid a lot more than I was actually being paid to be in the studio, and it was kind of the end of my decision to be in other people's work sort of finished in that moment. So I'm sort of looking at that. I'm also looking at I know within that conversation with MoMA, there were some issues that came up and questions with the people who were helping to organize the Abramovic. I mean, I was kind of privy to some of that conversation, even though I wasn't a part of it. But these sort of questions about like healthcare and these kind of things, and like assumptions that were being made. And so I'm really like thinking a lot about this around like a very secure wage. The structures, the organizations that are sort of around us as makers, as dancers, and how people are being paid, and yet there's this like trickle down to the very bottom where people are getting paid very little or hardly getting paid, and yet we're making the product.
I think that to me that also goes to, and I think this is really, you're making me think of two things. One, that this is actually something that should be revisited on a much larger scale, with a much larger dialogue, focused with artists on various different levels, dancers as well. But what you're speaking of is a perspective.
Helpful to all of us. And I say this with all due respect to all of you, amazing individuals in this room who are still out there doing work. A sense of like where we fit in as cultural workers into the larger macro economy. So let's look at a few basic things. So in the last 20 years, there's been a general deterioration of overall real wage rates in Western industrialized nations between 20 and 25%. that's affected industrial workers, the sort of shift of industrially paid work out of industrialized nations to other nations where pay scales are even lower than race to the bottom. And the jobs here have been replaced with typically low-paid service jobs. So not only ourselves, but 90+% of all workers in all occupations or preoccupations, as it were, are being paid much less than they were paid in the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Secondly, even in a case where there's a construction of our craft or whatever that, because of its social construction, puts it in a place where it can be paid, we ourselves tend to be in a position as people who are doing work that's more interesting, pushing bounds of form, content, political statement. We tend to be outside of the structures which are directly compensated. We know that because of the economic changes that really the increasing predominance of economic elite in governments and other areas in other aspects of our own civil society, that the values and the things that we do are being pushed to the side. So I think of the example, I have friends that dance on Broadway. I have friends that do theater on Broadway. They have unionized positions. They all have, it's been whittled away progressively. They have insurance, they have healthcare, they have all these things that we are looking for. They routinely go to YouTube to zero in on our work and carry those ideas that we create and don't get paid for into the precincts of their own developmental stages on Broadway or where else they do, and present those ideas as their own and refurbish their ticket sales, right? Often so goes under the commodified rubrics of fresh and new. So they're getting all of the benefit of our labor, intellectual labor, transgressive labor, and commodifying it, leaving us out of the compensation, reproducing that in a clearly Marxist sense, and producing that as their own work. So, for example, all these things are going on. How do you propose to pay your dancers a minimum wage when we're not even in a position where we can get our work legally recognized, so that the statutory guidelines which govern the administration of minimum wage can even be intelligible? And believe me, there are people who are going to insist that it's not intelligible to apply those minimum wage standards to the work that we do. So I think that in that sense and in other senses, there are a couple of things that come to mind for me, like how do we explore our linkages, as you were pointing out, some of the things that you all mentioned, but some of the things that you brought out in terms of like your work with organizing, especially the issue of domestic labor, which I know very well, from life experience as well as activist experience. How do we frame what we're doing in terms of our connection to the labor force as a whole, not necessarily entering into some kind of political alliance with the working force as a whole, but recognizing our position in a way that empowers us to make a difference in that position, A, and then B, looking at some of the other ways that work is done that actually represents a definitive rejection and divorcement from the social terminology and the deals that characterize the relationship. This kind of faux transgressive relationship that we have with the mainstream, where we're asking for something from the mainstream, namely hierarchicalized financial capital, and at the same time pushing against it. I had a conversation with a dancer, one of the street dancers, and I was telling him some things about things that I've done in the past, and his response was, you know, one of the reasons we do what we do and we're so aggressive in trying to get money from people is because we don't believe that we can actually do the work that we do by going to the theaters and doing the same kind of stuff that you all do inside those theaters. We're on the street because we can make more money on the street. The kid, 16-year-old kid, at the end of the day, proceeded to pull out a wad of bills from his pocket like, it looked like a couple $100. And he said, I have to share this with the 3 other brothers that I danced with, but I can make this. What can y'all do with a grant that you get from the man where he's not gonna pay, where he makes you go through all the paperwork to do this? All I gotta do is show my ass downtown by the train, flip around a little bit, and the bucket gets full. Wake up. And his train came and he left. So there are some people who are some of the best dancers on the planet right now who don't give a rat's ass about any of this stuff. They're saying that we're going to remake the world, remake the relationship of art to the public in our own terms, with our own mechanisms, in our own way. Now, of course, longevity is a real issue for them. They don't take care of themselves. They don't do this. They don't do that. We all know that there's limitations, that aesthetic limitations, maybe arguably, in the sense that they don't really absorb influences from a lot of different areas, and they're not trained in the way that many of the dancers in this room are trained in. But, you know, a lot of those kids are making money doing that dance. So somebody's making money doing that dance. And incidentally, it's the very same dancers who are coming from the same socioeconomic class that's being murdered by policemen who are policing economic inequality and authoritarian relationships of power, supervising gentrification in neighborhoods. I mean, the list goes on and on. And this is not, I don't want to become a Savonarola about this, but when I think of like things that have to really be addressed about what we do, those are the things that come to mind.
I just want to, before we continue the conversation, for people that need the elevator, it stops running in 10 minutes. So gather your things, and we should probably try to wrap up quickly. I mean, again, let me just reiterate this, because so many of the ideas that have surfaced already are just huge, intense, and meaningful, and so much to think about. I really appreciate everyone's thoughtfulness and experience and knowledge in this room. So just know that this is not, we don't need to arrive anywhere today, but these conversations we can continue to really and hopefully follow up some of these conversations.
I think Luke, you wanted to say something?
So I think that this is a conversation I'm trying to have a lot of people for a long time.
Could you speak up?
Listen, I've been trying to have this conversation. I've been trying to be involved in this conversation for a really long time. And dancing here and dancing in Ireland and dancing in a few places that you're talking about a few months ago.
Yeah.
So I've worked a bit in London, I've worked a bit in Ireland, I've worked a bit in Belgium, I've worked here for a number of years. And across it, kind of what I found here, what I find here is are some issues that are not actually as prevalent in other places. And when I try and have the conversation, the issue of transparency I find to be extremely difficult to tackle. You can sit around and have a pint with someone in a pub, and they will tell you their grievances. And you can sit at a round discussion like this, and people will kind of dance around their grievances in a way that to be absolutely very really happy about, which is lovely to hear. But a lot in my previous experience, people they don't want to be the person to say this person treated me badly, or they don't want to be the person to say I'm underpaid in this position, or they don't want to be the person to say my time is disrespected in this place. And I've tried so many times to have this conversation, and what I'm personally doing to try and tackle it and this kind of happiness as in a way that's not attacking. Like I don't want to be part of any kind of attacking actors, and I make work as well. And I really have to face what you're describing, is that when you're making a budget and your budget is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, that what point the dancer, everyone with dancer suddenly is becoming a resource, the only resource I have, because all my other resources are going away. I know these people will want to work with me. And so the dancer becomes a resource as opposed to something else. And how to fight that? And I guess what I'm kind of like just jumping onto what a lot of people, different people said is, I think that because in dance, that goes back to the same idea in music, that the composer is the master and the musician. You become a great musician and eventually maybe become a composer. I think that if you go back far enough, there's still this expectation that we latch onto, which is that the choreographer is this other form of artist that must have, you know, even in the genesis of some of the choreographers here, they're so well supported by Paul Taylor, danced with Martha Graham, you know, and it kind of continues through that. And this idea that this person is a master maybe because of their accolade as a dancer, and therefore the choreographer is a different tier of artist to the dancer, which I think is a really, especially in today's climate, is a really outdated way of looking at the role of the dancer versus the role of the choreographer. And as far as what you're describing about trying to create an atmosphere where that's not there, that makes the idea of pay even more delicate, because how can a choreographer make a living off their work if they're not providing that living for a dancer? And how can a choreographer be paid more for what they're doing as a choreographer if they're choosing to pay themselves more than the dancers who are in the room? No, I know this isn't necessarily a judgment or anything, but I do think it's part of the conversation. And I think that this idea of these roles does exist. And I think that because of that transparency, again, becomes an issue. The dancer comes and says, I understand that if you have very little money, that you can't pay me more, but is it really unnecessary? Is it really unreasonable of me to see where the money is going? Because again, coming back to where I'm really trying to, where my experience really comes in, is that you work with a company that has a budget of X, and their standards and practices are that they treat you this way. And then that company's budget skyrockets, and now they're a company with a budget and resources of Y, but their standards and practices don't change, because that's what they've gotten used to. That's the ambience that they've created for their dancers, and the dancers don't challenge that necessarily, or the dancers aren't challenging that in various places. So I think this conversation is really, and I'm really pushing for transparency. I'm involved in making a documentary series, which just kind of tries to talk to people in the field in various cities, and then bit by bit maybe tries to create this comparative analysis of like how artists are deeming themselves and relating to their work and how they're making things happen in different cities. Just as a kind of a case study to maybe encourage people to have that conversation about it.
I feel like this is what always gets a little tricky about this kind of like discussion, is it gets to be there's like microcosm and macrocosm. We're talking about like there's a lot of what we were talking about is money, but there's been like very little like talk about like some of the points that you brought up that were in the manifesto, the reason why you didn't have dollar amounts in the, I'm sorry, I didn't call it the compact. And I don't know, I think that this is what makes it really hard, is that because there hasn't been like set things that are really like established, and things have fallen apart, and the grants that were given to artists are gone, because there aren't rules, there are a lot of options. But I always feel like when we get into this conversation, it always feels like really like dark, like awful. Because, but I feel like for me, what makes it that way, the darkness is the capitalistic part of it, is the money part of it, and I felt like what brought me here today was I was like, there was some wording and some of the language that was used to describe this whole talk that kind of like had a few ideas or like ways to think about this that are not of the value. I don't know. I feel like we have options that are not money if we want to. And we live in New York City, and it's so expensive to live here. And so you have to do a whole lot of work doing something else if that's what happens. And what's interesting to me about that is that, like, for me personally, I've chosen to do that. I've chosen to do a whole lot of work that has absolutely nothing to do with dance. And it can be really miserable. But I also like realized that was a choice, and then there's also a lot of levity around that, and there's a lot of like feeling of reward. And so then like the dance making and the dancing can't have, it's possible that it can be more of a church, of a religion. And I talked about this a little bit with someone who was like, churches raise money and they're fucking money machines. And it's true. But we also don't have to be that either. I don't know. I just wanted to say that.
I just bear in mind, I think it's very, very good. I just want to strongly support your opinion because I think like me coming from also another country and having a difficulty with, like talking about money, it's like a taboo among everybody, and it's fake. In my opinion, like I work with people in a school where nobody knows who's paying more. It's like there's a sphere on, oh, she's gonna know how much I'm getting paid. It's not like any clarity among ourselves, that is very uncomfortable, and it becomes a great taboo to talk about that. And I think that the problem that I find when I have been part of different projects is a lack of clarity from the people that we're working, and it's silence, because it's like I don't care how much I'm getting paid, in terms of like that's not gonna affect the fact that I'm gonna work for you or not. But the fact that then I realize that my work, costed, that a machine that pulls somebody up and down during the performance cost, 100 times more than that I was not paid there. That's horrific to me. That's insulting, right? Not, so it's like where the clarity of the budget and the fact that, I think that we can start by being a little bit more transparent. And I think that has nothing to do, hey, listen, this is my budget, man. I am getting paid, this is my budget, you're getting paid this. Do you think it's fair? I think that just by starting there, I feel like I would be more comfortable, and at least that's what I do. I do create work myself too, and I sometimes create work out of nothing, like no money, no support, but it's a need. It's like I need to do it in order to just be a happy human being or somewhat happy human being. So, but I start by if I show work at the Thomson, I'm getting paid $150 for that opportunity, which I'm grateful for. Those $150 I show it to the performance. We are 12 people. Okay, let's go get a beer. You know what? I feel like for me that is equally divided into everybody. And I said, this is what I get paid. I go get a beer with you guys. I know it sounds like okay, what is this girl talking about? But then if I get paid, I don't know, $6,000 for a commission, like it's my responsibility for my performers, the people that I'm working with, saying, this is the budget that I have. I want you to know that the people that are here, you're getting paid this, you're getting paid this, you're getting paid this. Are you guys happy the way I'm dividing this? Because I don't know shit about economies and being fair. But if I feel like there is a transparency, we begin from an honest place, And so I just want to say I fully support your way of saying this, and I think that's what we have to begin by being transparent.
You're saying this, so if everyone approaches these problems the way that this conversation would be a lot easier, I think. But I think part of the issue is that the compact exists because not everyone is approaching these problems. And there is, I just said that I think the reason the compact, when I came across the compact, I had been maybe 3 weeks into trying to make something. I didn't know the compact existed. And I was trying to deal with this idea of standard codes and practices away from money, away from the idea of money, but just dealing with the idea of how dancers actually are given their time, how the idea of your time is going to be approached. Will there be in a 5-hour rehearsal, can I expect a 5-minute break to go to the bathroom or a 20-minute break for lunch? Because when none of these conversations are had and you find yourself in these pressurized situations, it's unpleasant. And I was kind of trying to form the idea of a proposal of the standard codes and practices, and I found it significantly more thorough well-written version of it in the compact, and I threw in my terrible little version of it, and I was reading the compact, and that comes out of a really, really careful, really considered dialogue about how to have a clear communication in a working environment. That's separate actually from the macro idea of how dance is funded and how we approach, but it's also still dealing with this idea of institutional levels, like MoMA to the kitchen to, it's got that within companies as well, that if a company has $500,000 a year budget, they're obviously going to have be able to facilitate things differently from a company with a $30,000 budget. So that there's still the ability of things to work on that tier as long as transparency is there. But I think that not everyone is approaching it.
Can I say one more thing? Because I feel like Levi said at the beginning, there's so many things that come up, and like you're saying, there's that thing about money, always it's about money, but I feel like, I mean, all of that you're saying is so important. And there's, just to point out, there's a lot of transparency that also doesn't happen. I mean, I'm always advocating for the dancer, having the dancer's time, but also to speak from the choreographer's perspective, the value of the work, of the basically 24 hours, because sometimes in the middle of the night you wake up, you can't sleep because how the fuck am I not pay people to make this thing work? So there's also like the value of the choreographer and the responsibility to pay for people and the debt that you're left with. I mean, there is a lot also on that other side. Also the value of all that time. But one thing I wanted to speak about from what you were talking about too is that I feel like we also have to be careful not to make the conversation only about like how can we value the work we do more in terms of dollars, and just because like you're saying the mainstream and this whole thing is like is it only about like valuing more cultural work so that we can fit into the system? I feel like there's a, I don't know, like I said before, like I'm trying to subvert these things, yet I know that we need the money and we're still in the system, but I feel like there's a thing about like, did we all get into dance because we're actually fuck the system? You know, like want to be outside there and that's the thing. I feel like I know that it's, I'm not sure how to answer that question, but I feel like there is that we need to value the work with money and we're in the system, but there's also the pushing against it because we can end up being just like workers for this bourgeois, like just let's make more money, let's value work more so we make more money, so make more nice work for the ones that fund us and support us so they can have fun time going out to the theater while they make more money.
This needs to be the last comment.
Some people have had their hands raised for a while. Maybe if we can just have three brief. You wanted to.
Can we just be brief so we can wrap up?
And Rebecca and Zach. I just wanted to respond directly to that. Because I really don't think, like in the visual arts, the wage stands for working artists in the greater economy.
You have to speak up, I'm
Sorry.
sorry.
Wage stands for working artists in the greater economy, so we're working in a visual arts presenting context in which there's a multi-billion-dollar industry, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So it's really easy to make the case for why artists should take a piece of that money. But one of the biggest stumbling blocks with artists is to convince them that there's no contradiction between doing something because you love it and you believe in it and getting paid for it. And this is like the primary problem in getting artists to mobilize and getting them to feel solidarity with one another is getting over the shame about that contradiction, which is like construction. It's a false dichotomy. It really doesn't mean anything. You can still do what you love to do and get paid for it. And resist the system. And
But that's what I mean, it's not,
I guess I was going to make a similar comment. I'm a writer, and writing used to be funded. You know, you used to get paid to do it, and so what we have is a freelancers union. But it's are we willing to set aside our individualistic sort of approach to our work and at least recognize that if we want to be paid, we have to unify and demand to be paid because we have to eat. I mean, you know, and we believe in our art, but we still have to eat. And the other thing is, I just wanted to recommend a foundation that actually supports workers in figuring out their situation, and that's the Discount Foundation. And they work with unions, they work with independent.
What was it called? Sorry.
The Discount Foundation. They're in, they're moving around a lot. I think they're in Illinois now. But, you know, you might want to look at them as a way of creating, you know, some structure for your.
I think they're active Detroit, a lot of
Yes.
anarchists that tap into the city, independent groups are just
Exactly.
creating their own governance, creating their own institutions.
Yes.
Around Zero.
Zach and there's no one more.
Okay, I'll try to be, I need to be brief, I will. So, I just wanted to add maybe a little bit different perspective. I came here because I used to dance with a guy named Min Tanaka, who's an organic farmer, and I was an early member of his company, Thomson. And at that time, all of us were engaged in the labor of farming work, and in the same place that we rehearsed, and in the same place that we created performances, and then we would also perform in Tokyo and in New York or in Europe and the United States. And at that time, I didn't really understand what that relation was, why we were farming. And now I'm writing my doctoral dissertation on Gibney, so I've been trying to articulate what the heck was that all about. And couple of things I've come up with are not so much how farming actually served the work. And it served it as a form of training. So given that we all need to work extra jobs, many of us need to work, do something. In Japan, many dancers, or several avant-garde dancers or experimental dancers, choose to do physical labor as consciously as a choice of a day job. So you have guys who are not in Tanaka doing construction, for example. Sugi Joseph, Jun Airi, who died falling off a high-rise building while he was doing construction. But with Min, the farming work, it served as a training. It served as it gave us access to a lot of space, so that we could, if we need a studio, we can build one, or we can rehearse on the field, or we could perform in the field. It gave access to a lot of space and materials to construct sets from. So it was an incredible resource for all these different aspects of it. So just sort of throwing that out there as a different model for the relation between labor and dance. And also flipping the hierarchy as well, because if you're a farmer and a dancer, then where's the hierarchy? There's no hierarchy between someone who's an artist and someone who's physical.
Yvonne Rayner and Eileen Kasloff had a talk at the museum that Movement Research umbrellaed, and Yvonne said, we didn't think of this as a profession. Someone had, Jimmy Waring had a job at the post office. I had money from my parents, and and we did this. And I think, musicians don't work if there's not certain economic conditions. So one question is, are we willing to not work? Are we committed to considering this a profession? Or do we want to consider other models, and what are the consequences of that?
Just in response to that, there was an issue with equity in LA where basically they were trying to raise the minimum wage for actors, and the actors sort of revolted against it because it would cause the closure of a number of theaters. And so basically they were willing to sacrifice their wages in that way to create that, to continue that environment. And I think, just in reference, like there's so many different forms of dance and so many different paradigms of like what labor is within the field that it's harder to go like, okay, this is the amount you should get, or what is minimum wage for this. But I feel like, again, it's part of the dialogue of understanding, because amongst ourselves, it's going to make only a small amount of difference. But because ultimately, where does the choreographer get their money from? Their day job or a funder? Now, if you lose your day job, then you depend on the funder, that's kind of the stream, or if you're getting it from a presenting organization that's giving you permission, understanding. I think for me, basically, to be brief, it's about really understanding the whole ecosystem, educating yourself, and then creating dialogues, whether it's about transparency and why transparency is not offered for various reasons, whether it's personal or business, or just how we can who's actually pushing the buttons. because we're just at the bottom of the section.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, this is so fascinating for me. I mean, I learned so much from Abigail, but I just want to say it can be done. You can put prices on things. If we did it, Wage did it within the nonprofit sector, and it seems to be working. But I think the big problem that you have here is that you have a split authorship between the choreographer and the dancer. In the art field, the artist is the author, and you can always, that's sort of like, it's a kind of a single entity. But here you're working in coordination with one another, supporting one another, so you don't want to be seen as antagonizing the choreographer who is your employer, who is also the person who you may end up being one day when you become a choreographer after you become a dancer or something like that. I mean, I think this is a really complicated issue, and that seems to be what's at core here. But I feel like if it's dancers that are organizing, it's one position, and if it's choreographers organizing against institutions or in relation to them, it's another thing. And it's another thing if choreographers and dancers are organizing